Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I now call to order this work session of the Anchorage Assembly regarding property evaluations or green cards. It is Friday, January 28, 2022. We are noticed from 2:10 to 3:10 p.m. today. Ms. Camacho, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Ms. Allard? Constant?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy? Ms. LaFrance?
Here.
Mr. Perez-Verdia?
Here.
Peterson?
Present.
Vitson?
Here.
Present if you called my name.
I did, thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Mr. Weddleton's excused. He has another meeting.
Okay. And Ms. Zalatel?
Here.
Thank you. You have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Camacho. There are no documents for this work session, and I see we have Municipal Manager Ms. Demboski. Ms. Demboski, who is on for the administration?
Thank you, Chair LaFrance. The Finance Department, as well as the Property Appraisal Section, are all on. So this actually is going to be led by CFO Frisk, and I'll just turn it over to him, and he can kind of walk you through their process, who's going to be representing the Finance Department, and they'll be available to answer all your questions.
Great, thank you, Ms. Demboski. And before I go to you, Mr. Frisk, I just want to note for members of the public or anyone else who's joining that the 2022 real property assessment notices, which we refer to as green cards, were mailed to residents earlier in January. And as a result of this annual process, Assembly members have been receiving questions from constituents regarding property valuations and appeals. And I know there was some initial discussion about green cards in last week's Budget and Finance Committee meeting. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to you now, Mr. Frisk. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair LaFrance. On behalf of the Finance Department and the Assessors Division, we appreciate the time to discuss the green cards. I guess the big thing for us is what would you like us to talk about? We weren't exactly sure what, because there was no documents, no paperwork or anything. What would you like us to, where would you like us to start, I guess is the question. Or do you have questions that you would like to ask and we can just start with the answers and go from there?
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. I'll go ahead and ask members if they want to go ahead and put themselves in the queue. We have Mr. Constant first. Go ahead, Mr. Constant.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. I think the first place to start with is a recognition that we're hearing broadly from the community some concerns about the increases in the assessments. And so one thing we would like to do, I believe, I guess I'll speak for myself. One thing I would like to have us do in this conversation is provide an on-the-record brief to the public about what the factors are that are pushing those assessments, and then what opportunities the public has to bring those questions forward if they believe something is inaccurate. Because I've been fielding those conversations in the community, but I think it's better to have us convene to have that talk so the public can come to this record.
Thank you, Mr. Conference. Student Chair, let's talk about the appeal process first, and then we'll come back to how the values are determined. So everybody received a green card. On that green card, there is a specific date that is listed on the green card that appeals have to be made by, and that date is the 11th of February. We are already receiving appeals. We are also receiving inquiries. We've had over 400 inquiries in the first 10 days of the cards being sent out. We are fielding the calls. Typically, we have a 2-day turnaround from when somebody makes an inquiry to when we have a response. I'm gonna step you back into 2020 for just a second. We only fielded 336 appeals in the entire 2020 season. We anticipate that we're going to see probably close to 600, maybe 700 appeals going forward. So right now, we're responding within 3 days of an inquiry that comes in from the public because of the fact that we're seeing such an increased volume of requests. So that's the appeal process. Once it hits the staff, then at that point in time, the staff will do their due diligence, reviewing the property assessment, how was the property valuation, excuse me, and how it was determined. The recommendation will then flow up to me on whether to leave the assessment as is or make an adjustment, at which case then that will be communicated via letter back to the applicant or appellant, however you want to put it. And then at that point, if we decide that we're good with the assessment and evaluation that we provided to them, if they want to progress that appeal, they can take it to the Board of Equalization.
All right, so that's the process. And then the other question, what are the factors, the forces?
So there's two parts to the valuations. So first, we need to separate that there are two parts, one of which is the commercial property and then the personal property. Residential property, excuse me, my mistake. So with that said, I'm going to ask Ben Marukian, in charge of commercial, to tell you the process of valuing a commercial piece of property within the city limits. So Ben, please.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair. So for our commercial appraisals, we have a handful of property types, subtypes, and that includes multifamily, industrial, retail, restaurant, hotels. Each of those is valued based on the most appropriate method, but we use multiple methods to, like, the different approaches to value, the cost approach, the sales approach, the income approach, as the data fits. And you all know that we struggle to get a lot of good data, but we use what we get, and it supports the changes that we make. And probably the most important thing is that throughout the process of valuation, when we use mass appraisal techniques, we can go back and during any appeal, we can look at those changes that we've made or look at the values that we have, and we can look at the sales data that we have or the income data that we have, and the appellant can bring in their information as well. And we can determine whether or not the mass appraisal methods that we use to set the values were accurate. And if they're not, we can adjust them. And that's what the appeal season is for. Some of the factors I think Mr. Constant was asking about, for basically, it's simple supply and demand. And in the commercial sectors, most of the commercial sectors, we're a little flush. We got a little too much, especially, hotels. You can see people keep building hotels. Most of those investors are from out of state. They're real estate investment trusts that are interested in developing in our area, not because it makes sense for our best interest, but because it makes sense for their best interest. But when we have too much inventory, too much brick and mortar retail, and people are moving from brick and mortar retail to Amazon and all the web retail purchasing habits, those things are affecting how much demand there is for people to expand their spaces. And when they don't choose to say, I want to renew my lease, or I want to expand my lease into that new space that's open, then there's vacancy. And a lot of the for rent or for sale signs on the commercial real estate are old and dirty because they've been there for a while. So a little too much supply compared to how much demand we have for a lot of the retail sectors. That's probably the simple
So
straightforward.
I'm going to jump in. I have a couple follow-ups on that. And I'll try to be brief, Madam Chair. So we just heard from you talking about commercial. I haven't had any complaints from a single commercial land owner about their tax assessments. They're usually a little more subtle in their approach, but I do sometimes hear from them. So I imagine we have a parallel presentation for the residential side, but let me see if I get the implication of what you just said. Is the implication then that one of the main forces is that because there's so much oversupply in the retail market, the revenues are down because the values are down, which is pushing over increases in the residential, or is there an impact there? Are they correlated somehow?
No. Sorry, those are independent. Mr. Frisk asked me to talk about commercial valuation, and we're talking about commercial. And when I say independent, I mean we're all in one economy, so nothing is in a vacuum. But I was talking
guess
about
maybe they can-
definitely the forces for commercial real estate. It's a different market. You have different buyers and sellers, right? So we're about to talk about residential, and that. I mean, when you're ready, if I've answered your questions about
Yeah,
commercial, I
So the
can.
connection would be on the levy, not on the evaluation. So, okay, thank you.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you,
So
Ben. I appreciate that, Ben. Well, Mr. Constant, to follow up with that, we do have Tim Tanji from the residential area, and he will speak to the valuations on that.
Thank you.
Again, I just wanted to split it. It is split. There are two different unique parts of the assessor's plan. One is commercial, one is residential. Tim is sitting right here with me. So Tim, if you wouldn't mind, please explain the process to the Mr. Constant and the assembly.
Sure, through the chair to Assemblyman Constant. We appraise condominiums and multifamily, primarily on the market approach. And so that's fairly easy and straightforward to understand. We're just taking, what properties have transacted for in the past couple of years and using that to dial in for the valuation of the property. When it comes to single family properties, however, we're using the market adjusted cost approach. And so what the cost approach basically is the cost to construct that building, then accounting for depreciation since built, and then you add in the value of the land. And then the market part of that is that we take in sales from owners throughout the municipality throughout the year. And then we use that to kind of support what the cost approach is doing. And so, anyone that knows anything about the construction market knows that in the past year, the cost of materials was quite high, especially in spring. I believe the dollar per board square or foot was about $1,600 or $1,700, and that was up quite significantly. And so what this does is that it raises the cost of properties. And then also we have what the market is doing. And so the market has been very strong. In 2015, for instance, we had about 900 residential properties, which is condominiums and single family properties. And in just a couple of weeks ago, I looked, or excuse me, a couple of days ago, it was 84 condos and about 120 single family properties. So obviously the supply is down. We can't see what the actual volume is doing. So if these properties are transacting within 1 or 2 days, one, that kind of speaks to the hot market. But two, that could, potentially influence, how much I'm really seeing as far as supply. But due to the fact that, it's just so different than it was a couple of years ago, there's much more competition for houses. It's a seller's market. Houses are on the market for a very few number of days. And, oftentimes we'll see multiple bidders on a house, and that can potentially drive up the purchase price of that house. And then so when we get these sales in, and I should say that, we've been in the pandemic for a couple of years now, and this is, I think, has been influencing sales. As more people have more time at home, they can look and see what properties are available. Maybe they're feeling like this is an okay time to move into a different house. And so we have, some considerable demand and a low supply, and that, is driving up prices.
So I would say that exactly matches my perception of the marketplace, and it's a fair assessment from where I sit. And just an anecdote, last night I saw an image of a house in one neighborhood that had giant 8x4 sign made out of lights that said, "Please sell us your home," which just is a testament to the difficulty in the market finding an actual home. So last question, and this one's short and doesn't need an answer now, Travis, but the one complaint that I heard this year that hit to the heart was, I know a senior citizen whose property values for the first time have exceeded his state allowed and assembly authorized tax credit. And I wonder if there's any effort to either inflation proof or tackle the issue of the fact that we're now getting to the point in the market where our seniors are being hit with tax bills that never have before because the market has increased so much.
Through the chair, Mr. Constant, thank you for the question. I'm going to have to put a pin in that one and come back to you and discuss it. At this point, we have not had any conversations about that, but I think it's worthy of a conversation, but not necessarily right at this minute.
No, that's great. Just put it on the table. Thank you, and that's my question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do want to respond one additional piece about the residential real estate market. We also need to remember that we're at uniquely low interest rates for refinancing and financing of home purchases, which is an additional fuel on the fire of why houses are selling and the market is extremely hot. You can get sub-3 financing on purchases. It's just an incredible anomaly right now, but it also drives the price of the houses up and in the market. I can tell you from true testament that my neighbor across the street put a for sale sign on his house on a Friday, and on Sunday night they were putting a sale pending sign on top of that one because it left in 2 days and they had multiple offers. So we know the market's hot. I know people are not happy about this, but it is what it is, and the numbers are representative of it.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk, and thank you, Mr. Constant. I want to note for the record that Ms. Kennedy joined at 2:15. Next, we have Mr. Perez-Verdia and then Mr. Peterson. Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Perez-Verdia. We are unable to hear you. Okay, we will go to Mr. Peterson and then come back to Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was just going to ask Mr. Frisk if the Fed ends up raising interest rates a couple, 3 times between now and the end of the year, do you think that could have a cooling trend on our housing market? Are people trying to get the new house bought now or change houses now while the interest rates are still low? Thank you.
Through the chair, Mr. Peterson, I wholeheartedly agree with you that there could be a cooling dependent on what the Fed does with interest rates. However, we need to note that the Fed controls the prime lending rate and the rate that banks charge each other. The actual mortgage industry is a little bit separate in that it is impacted, but not as great as you would think. So as long as these numbers stay in this artificially low environment that they've been in for several years, I'm not sure if this will slow down. When we start seeing 30-year money on new purchases at $500,000 creep up into the 4% range, then you're going to see it slow down. But until then, I think it's still going to be a hot market. I think people are selling their houses. The $200,000 to $500,000 house, which is classified as your starter home, is going to be on the market for, a week or 2 at the most, and then it's going to be off because everybody's getting low interest rate loans and they're upgrading their house. The people that are selling their $500,000 house are then turning it and potentially going into a $900,000 house or such. And the differential is, hey, my payment on my house went up $500 and I just earned a $300,000 increase on the house because I had so much equity built up in the one I just left.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson, and thank you, Mr. Frisk. Mr. Constant?
Yeah,
you would like to
thanks.
follow up?
This is just anecdotal because this is my personal experience, but when I bought my house in January of 2018, the interest rate was where I have it now, 3.875. It went down very low, but it has now come back up by 2.5 points from where I was in the program that I have. So we're well on the way to that upward tick of the rates. They are still low, but they are where they were 5 years ago, not where they were 2 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I will go back to Mr. Perez-Verdia. Mr. Perez-Verdia? Okay, are there any other members who have questions? While we're paused, I'll put myself in the queue for a comment/question. And it was favorably resolved from the perspective of the constituent. But I had heard from a constituent who had an issue with the residential homeowner exemption. And the feedback that she provided was she felt like the form was a little bit vague and she wasn't clear on whether or not, like, for a bank statement, if that meant every month or every year. And one of the reasons why she needed help was because she did not realize that only the first person listed on the form is the one for whom the exemption applies. And she and her husband own the home, but only his name was listed on the form, and he had spent too much time out of state for work to qualify for the exemption. So I guess to Mr. Frisk, just some feedback. One, it was resolved to the satisfaction of the homeowner. So thanks to the property appraisal team for working with her on that. And then two, just, is there anything we can do to make the form maybe a little bit more user-friendly, or help people understand too that they need to be proactive when requesting exemptions to ensure that if anything changes, that will mean when they apply, they need to make sure that has been corrected or changed. Thank you.
Chair LaFrance, I appreciate the feedback. We're always looking for ways of improving and making the process efficient, and we will take that back to the staff and see what we can do about making the form more friendly, user friendly at that point. I'm glad the resolution was met for your constituent. That is a frequent occurrence when you have spouses where it is on the first primary one on the account, and that individual does reside in another state, even though the secondary spouse is in the state. It's unfortunate that we don't have a way of splitting that. I'm not sure you can. So at this particular point, yeah, it is a situation. We're always here to help and resolve issues that come up.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. I appreciate that. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. Since we have the time on the topic that I previously brought up, Ms. Frisk, the idea of looking closely at that senior tax abatement for the possibility of working with the state to allow for some kind of inflation proofing, because 150 or whatever it is now, 100 isn't what it used to be because of the valuations in the market. It raises in my memory the concern that Ms. Kennedy brought up that I think is one worth looking at in concert with this conversation. And this is the idea of figuring out a way to allow the residential property tax exemption to follow a senior if they have to go into a home, or to maintain on their primary residence if they're living in a third-party place until such time as they can no longer maintain ownership of their home. And so some of these issues are quite sensitive and important, but of course they're long-term and tactical.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Frisk?
Okay, so through the chair, Mr. Constant, the exemption is 150,000. Again, you would, how to, give me a second. I got it. There's a process in which you, for the exemption falls in the senior and vet exemption that is part of the Alaska statute 2945.030. That needs to be changed at a state level before
Yep.
we can implement it at a municipal level. So.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. It's long-term and tactical, but it's certainly worthy putting on the table if we're finding the real estate market is booming and it's putting seniors at risk because the value of their home is suddenly pushing them into a category of taxation that they can't afford, which risks pushing them out of their home. Then we ought to be looking at that for if the projections are a stable or increasing real estate market over the next 5 years, right? Then we should be looking at this in the context of how do we protect the senior citizen population. So it is a state joint municipal project. It's not short term.
I fully concur with you on that.
Thank you, Mr. Constant, and thank you, Mr. Frisk. I just want to note Mr. Perez-Verdia was having tech issues, but his question was answered. So we will go to Ms. Zelatel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to follow along what Mr. Constant said. Ms. Kennedy also raised another issue. So perhaps there's a work group or folks who are interested in looking at recommendations that the municipality can maybe make to the state. But people who are on fixed income through Social Security, SSI, can get to the point where depending on how they are in their residence, particularly if the home is inherited, where their income just simply won't meet the demand, much like seniors, but there isn't the same kind of exemption. So, I think this would be something worthwhile to look at for the remainder of 2022 and maybe consider as something we would want to put forward as a legislative priority for next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zelatel. Did anyone from the administration want to comment?
So this is Mr. Constant, and I'm going to jump in if I might.
Go ahead.
On the topic. So now I was having this conversation with a friend who raised the concern, and his property tax values relative to the state income tax deduction that he's allowed puts him into the category where he will pay $16 of real property taxes on his property. And so I had to chuckle at that because the tax burden that I bear is substantially larger than $16. But I also put my compassion hat on because this person has been living in this world for a very long time and doesn't have the means to stretch. And so I just want to put real numbers to the idea and talk about how grave these issues are for people at that end of the economic strata.
Chair LaFrance, if I may, and expand a little bit on the previous conversation that we had with Assemblymember Constant. We talked, there's $150,000 exemption for seniors, but there's also a $50,000 residential exemption as well. Now, both of them are controlled at the Alaska state statute, and that if you guys want to increase those, or as in Assemblymember Zeltel's comments, and start being inclusive of others that are on fixed incomes for various reasons. Again, that's something that needs to be brought up at a state level. Right now, seniors in the municipality get $150,000 senior exemption plus a residential exemption of 50 grand. So it's $200,000 at this point in time. So just for perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. Mr. Constant, any follow-up?
Maybe I misunderstood. Are you suggesting that they can use both of those deductions?
Through the chair, Mr. Constant, yes, the seniors are eligible to use the $150,000 and the $50,000.
That's
So
great.
yeah,
I will check
they're
with them.
eligible for $200,000 of exemptions on their property.
I'll check with them right now because that might, for this one individual, be the solution for this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk, and thank you, Mr. Constant. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize to Mr. Frisk if I missed a few minutes of your presentation. I was pulled away for a moment. So if you addressed this already, I apologize. But I'm curious how some of these valuations will interact with the actual mill rate, given the tax cap. So, you know, we spread the property tax burden amongst a number of properties. And I understand that, you know, commercial properties on average went down, but of course, residential properties are the significant majority of the taxes that we collect. And so if folks' valuations went up and enough valuations went up, but the total amount of taxes we can collect is, is the same because the tax cap and because of the budget we passed is not significantly larger than last year's, then does that mean the mill rates for some folks will fall? Or I guess there's one mill rate, but is there a chance the mill rate will fall or won't rise as much? Because I think some people look at that and say, oh, my property taxes, the value of my home went up 10%. Does that necessarily follow that their property taxes went up 10%?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Assemblymember Dunbar. The mill rate is actually more, it should be addressed by OMB. And it's a method to equate the evaluations to the required amount of taxes, obviously, to support the budget. So as far as the mill rate setting, that's an OMB calculation and equation. We set the assessed value and they make that determination, and then Treasury would then bill for it. So that's the interaction on this particular subject. You would think, I mean, in hypothetical, and I'm not speaking on behalf of OMB in any way, shape, or form, but if your budget is the same from year 2021 and year 2022, if it's the same and your values went up, then the assumption would be that the mill rate would probably come down and your taxes would be commensurate to what they were the year before. But again, that's a different department that handles that.
Is there anyone from OMB here that could speak to that?
Madam Chair, this is Cheryl Fresca, and yes, we can. And if you'll give us a moment, we actually have a slide to share or two. Okay, if that's all right.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Frasca.
Okay. Hold one moment while we get it set up. We'll just take a moment. Marilyn?
And it looks like someone has their hand up. May I ask, who is that?
It's Miss Fresca, Suzanne.
Oh, it is. Okay, thank you, Austin. I could not tell from here.
One moment.
And then after Mr. Dunbar, Ms. Kennedy is in the queue, and I don't know if your question is on a different topic. Crystal, I guess we can just wait here.
Yeah, actually it is. It's back to a comment that Mr. Constant made. And Ms. Zelatel.
Do you want to go ahead and make your comment now?
Sure.
Ms. Kennedy?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the information in regard to the tax exemptions that, you know, the two that are allowed to be taken together is the residential, the 50,000, and then you can choose, if you're eligible, to take either the senior citizen exemption or the disabled veteran. You cannot take both of those, even if you would technically be eligible. You can't take both of those, but you can take one of those and the 50,000. My understanding, though, is that the state is working on some legislation that will probably try to add the layer that there'd be maybe a permanently disabled person eligible or exemption eligibility. However, I also understand that if they do that, they're considering foregoing the 50,000 residential eligibility tax exemption. So anyway, just kind of wanted to bring that up, that you can't double dip on the 150,000, but you can do the 50,000 and one of the 150,000 if you're eligible. Thanks.
Chair LaFrance, this is Travis again. To dovetail off that and answer a question that Mr. Constant asked previously, to clarify on the residential portion of that, the 50,000, that's the cap on it. It's 50,000 is the cap. It's actually a formula of 20% of the property value up to $50,000. So if your constituent's property is only oh geez, I don't know, $500,000. It's only 20% of the value. Okay, up to 50,000. We'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk, and thank you, Ms. Kennedy.
Okay,
Ms.
Madam-
Frasca?
Thank you. If we can share the screen, we'd be glad to just walk through a couple of slides that might help show the relationship that Mr. Dunbar was asking about.
Great. Ms. Camacho? Thank you.
Go to slide 2. Slide 2 with the mill rate calculation. Okay, all right. Are we ready? This is so exciting. All right, so just briefly about how the mill rate is actually calculated. All right, so the first, it's math. So you take the total property taxes to be collected. Okay, this is the spending piece of it. Property taxes to be collected divided by the total assessed value. And then you multiply that, the answer to that, by 1,000, and that equals the average mill rate. And so what we're going to do now is walk you through a couple of scenarios that shows the relationship between the property taxes to be collected and the assessed value. So let's take a hypothetical base tax year of $320 million. And so that's total property taxes to be collected. Let's say the assessed value for the municipality is $34 billion. And that's again divided by, the answer to that equals 0.0094. So that's the tax per dollar of assessed valuation. So then to establish the mill rate, you multiply this number by 1,000, and that equals the mill rate. And you know, in the back of the budget books, there's charts that show all the different mill rates by service areas or taxing districts. And so this is a number that's usually quite familiar to you. So then, okay, that's all interesting. So then how much do property taxes, the homeowners pay in property taxes? So that calculation, we took the taxes per say a hypothetical $100,000 of assessed value would be $941. And let's say the average assessed value of a house is, or property is $350,000. So the taxes that that taxpayer would pay is $3,294. Okay, so that sort of walks you through the relationship of the various pieces of information. Now, in order to bore you to death, we're going to go through another scenario. So let's say that the property taxes you're going to collect stays the same, but the assessed values go up. So in this, we still have the same $320 million of property taxes to be collected, but our assessed value overall has gone up 10%. So you do again the same math, you get the tax per dollar of assessed value, the 0.0086 times 1,000 equals a mill rate of 8.56. So then, okay, what does that mean to the taxpayer? Okay, taxes per $100,000 of assessed value, 856. Wow, that's less than, you know, under our original scenario. But your assessed value's gone up 10%. So you've got a higher home cost. So what does that mean in terms of taxes for $350,000? Oops, that's a little footnote. But so the answer is it's still $3,294, same number as before, even though assessed values went up $10,000, 10%. Okay, so one more scenario. Let's say taxes stay the same. Assessed value goes down. Okay, you're still collecting 320 million. Assessed values have gone down 30.6 billion. Here's your calculation, 0.0105. Mill rate 10.46. The mill rate has gone up, even though your assessed value has gone down. So taxes per 100,000, 1,046. Your assessed value is down 10%. The taxes for $350,000 home is, guess what? Same amount, $3,294. So what's the lesson to be learned here is that it's interesting about all the mill rates. It's interesting, a point of reference for all the assessed value. But what determines how much is going to be paid in property taxes is associated with the total property taxes to be collected. It's math. And one other point is they were talking about the property assessment, the exemptions. Remember that with our tax cap, if we don't exempt the property of somebody else, that those taxes are still going to be collected and paid by other people. So you just shift the tax burden to others when you give a break to one group. So setting aside the merit of that group getting the benefit, that's a different policy question, certainly. But in terms of the math, keep that in mind. So with that, we do have a couple of other scenarios, but we wanted to make the point about the relationship between mill rates, assessed value, and property taxes to be collected, and then how much taxpayers pay. So with that, I'll turn it back over, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Frasca. And would you be able to share these slides with Ms. Camacho so we can get them posted to the work session site?
Absolutely.
And shared? Great, thank you. So I do have two members in the queue. First, Mr. Dunbar, and then Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Dunbar?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to really thank Ms. Frasca for that really clear presentation. And, I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about how property taxes operate. And so I've gotten a couple emails. I think we've even got some to the whole assembly that say, hey, you just increased my property taxes 10 or 15 or 20%. This is going to be very hard for me. But as that presentation lays out, it's not really it's not a clean one-to-one. If your assessment goes up and assessments are going up broadly, that means that the mill rate will most likely fall. And so property taxes might stay steady for that person. Now, that being said, because commercial values fell, or at least most of them did, or some of them did, that indicates there probably will be an increase for folks that saw their assessed value go up on the residential side. But it probably won't be anywhere near as extreme as one-to-one to their property value increase. So I just think that's something that's really important to keep stressing when people are talking about this. And doesn't mean that they shouldn't appeal their assessed value. Doesn't mean that it might not concern them. But this is incomplete. We don't know what the mill rate is going to be yet, and so you can't do that one-to-one comparison. So again, really appreciate Ms. Frasca's very clear presentation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. And I want to read something that Ms. Quinn Davidson put in the chat. Thanks, Ms. Frasca. Very helpful information and very well organized. And I would echo that. Thank you very much, Ms. Frasca. Next is Ms. Kennedy and then Mr. Constant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I absolutely appreciate the presentation there, the slides as well. Ms. Frasca, thank you. And I certainly understand, and I've always understood that there's not necessarily a direct relationship between the valuation and the tax rate. However, my question is more in regard to the number, the taxes to be collected. My understanding is that number actually does fluctuate per the tax cap calculation, that it's allowed to fluctuate a certain amount every year, with there being a ceiling by which it can't exceed. But that's actually a variable that does have other multipliers with it. So it's often hard to say what that number is going to be year to year because the tax cap actually, the formulation of the tax cap actually allows it to increase. So is that true, or where am I off base with that one? Thanks.
So, Madam Chair, was that a question to me or to Travis? Travis is the number, I think. But I mean, the taxes, I'll take it. The taxes to be collected is based on the spending decisions that the mayor proposes and the assembly approves, and then the assembly overrides, and we have that dance. But ultimately, that's what is that number in that calculation. It's the amount of property taxes allowed to be collected per the tax cap or other actions by the assembly. That's the basis for the number. And then, of course, we do it by service areas, you know, so there's the 5 area-wide, police, fire, etc. So we have to calculate different mill rates within each of those service areas based on the assessed value of properties in that service area. So that goes into it too. But it really is about how much it collect to support spending. So if you want property taxes to go down, you spend less.
Thank you, Ms. Frasca.
Right.
Any follow-up, Ms. Kennedy?
Well, I'm still thinking through that because I think, you know, there is a nuance there with that number that absolutely can fluctuate. And I can see where it could fluctuate according to the budget that's approved. But at the same time, when we continually say that we're going to tax to the cap, we change that number every year according to what the tax cap allows. So I guess I'm just saying that I believe that number could stay the same year to year if you know, a budget were approved in that way. But the tax cap actually provides a multiplier by which that can be changed automatically, if you will. So anyway, I guess I can, you know, spend some more time really fleshing this one out a little bit. But thank you, Ms. Frasca. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Constant?
Yeah, thanks. So I think, Cheryl, this all alludes to the idea that we should once again have a conversation with you about the mechanics of all this, because, you know, you would assume taxes go up or taxes stay flat, but still within the context of each of those service areas and each of those types of property, there are many factors that influence where the numbers finally settle. What percentage is appropriated from commercial properties? What percentage is appropriated from residential properties? How many new houses were built? What tax credits and tax abatements have been applied to what properties? Burdens were, all of these things. And so I think probably in the spirit of the very clear presentation you just gave us, it might be wise to also have, when it's convenient and feasible, as we get closer to the mill levy in May, a conversation about all of those mechanics, not the simple up or down, but also the movement to the side and to whom the burden picks up when someone else doesn't, and all of that stuff. It's a very interesting topic. It's not arithmetic, it's something else.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Okay, I don't see any other members in the queue. Do members have any other questions or comments?
Chair LaFrance, this is Travis. I do want to make one comment for the group of for everyone. As indicated, and we all know that there's a heightened sense of potential appeals that will be coming through on behalf of the valuation card, the green cards that just went out. The assessor's office is fully prepared for that. We've taken the necessary steps to ensure that we are addressing all the issues. Some questions that popped up about the fact that we currently have a vacancy at the municipal assessor's level. That does not impact the appeal process at all. I want to clearly state that for everybody in case somebody says, oh, they're slow because they don't have a municipal assessor. That's not the case. If we're going to be slow, it's because we're receiving a very high volume of activity. My commitment to you is this: I will let you know if we start to receive absorbent amounts of inquiries and appeals that is slowing the process down. I'll let you know so you can be ready to talk to your constituents who may call back to you and say, hey, it took them 4 days to get to me instead of 3. So we are prepared for this, and we will do our best to stay on track in a timely manner, but just be aware, we're expecting a very large uptick in appeals this year.
Thank you, Mr. Frisk. Are there any other comments or questions? Seeing no one else in the queue, thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Mr. Frisk and Ms. Frasca and Mr. Marukian. And with that, we will go ahead and adjourn. We are adjourned.